You'll be back.
It responds to both of you in a certain way. I have kind of questions, but also maybe something of an answer to what he was talking about when he says, because I agree with him that I think classical realism in particular was really about liberalism in many ways. But if liberalism is no longer as compelling as it is, what does this make realism unrealistic? And I think that's the case. But that makes me ask about sort of the point of what we're doing here, especially in terms of classical realism, because if we've reached the limits of what liberalism can do, and liberalism also sort of contains not only the seeds of its own destruction, but the seeds of our destruction in general, because it is such a pervasive type of politics. And even if you don't agree with it, you're responding to it kind of thing. And it is, the French Revolution may have lost the battle, but it won the war, and as much as there is an international world order, that's what it is kind of thing. But if that's the case, if that's the focus of our politics in that traditional way, has that contributed to the creation of problems that this form of politics cannot solve? Is kind of what I'm interested in. I think you see that with something like nuclear weapons, where you just can't solve it through the way that we've approached politics in the past. But what I actually am more concerned about is something like environmental degradation, is the thing that always comes up to me, because I think it's a bigger issue than nuclear weapons, because that destroys your ability to have any kind of politics if it does actually come to pass, if it's as bad as it could be. And so I kind of wonder about talking about reorienting realism, although I do think your last point is good in terms of thinking of, who else can we reach out to? But my concern is that in as much as realism is tied to liberalism, and if this form of politics has created problems that it can't solve, I think another intellectual and academic issue is that we still are continuing to think in terms that cannot address the problems that we face, even in talking about how can we, re-engage with realism, or how can we revive these ideas, or how can we, but that's still keeping us at the same level of politics and surrounding the same issues that are, I think, at this point at least, fundamentally incapable of addressing bigger problems that it's created, and also a conceptual barrier to coming up with an alternative that might address it, because we can't let go of how we have effective politics. So yes, that's kind of what I think.
While I'd like to water classes, let me offer a response to that, and he can too. Rephrase it. The first thing I'd say, I think you're absolutely spot on, but the caveat is that term liberalism. I agree with Mike, so other critics that in a certain sense, classical realism is an attempt to say liberalism. But it's a certain kind of liberalism. And it's steering, or it's trying to steer its way between what you might call the Scylla of Nietzschean, complete Nietzschean collapse on one hand, and the kind of rationalist liberalism that was becoming dominant at the time that Morgan Howe was a young man, which he saw destroyed. So the first question that I would have, this caveat I would have, is and there I think there are people who are not realists, identified realists, but nonetheless share certain aspects of what we might call realists. And I say this is a piece of shameless self-promotion, that I have a paper coming out in another volume, which is called Realism Tamed or Liberalism Trade, Dystopic Liberalism and International Order. And that is a discussion of people like Judith Schwab, Stanley Hoffman, Dr. Tu, or to some extent, Bernard Williams, who are not realists and are liberals of a sort, but they are what I call dystopic liberals, what Schwab called liberals of theory. That is to say, they are people who do not see liberalism as conventional constructionists, conventional liberals, academic liberals, or indeed political liberals. It's not liberalism of rights, it's not liberalism of personal development. Liberalism of theory suggests that the core of liberal politics is the fear of arbitrary power, whether exercised by states, or corporations, or intellectual fashion, or whatever it might be. Now, it seems to me, in other words, if you want to cut liberalism up like that, it doesn't seem to me that that form of liberal politics per se is out of court. Much of what passes for liberal politics today, I absolutely 100% agree, usually very much in neoliberalism, economy, whatever, is something very different. And with that, I don't think most of the classical realists would have had much trouble. With liberalism of fear, I think they would have had a lot of trouble. And I think that therefore there are ways in which it seems to me that you could reshape liberal politics, or the understanding of liberal politics, around that would first of all be consonant with political realism, at least the classical realists of the first generation, and that might offer us at least thoughts that deal even with the really difficult questions being mentioned, like environmental degradation. I mean, one of the things it seems to me, I mean, Morgenthau wrote extensively on the nuclear question very, very informatively and I think very insightfully. But we might also say that there is an element in which, and through which, we simply want to say there is a kind of a conditional choice here. We cannot maintain the contemporary international system in the way that it is being maintained, because the assumption of the international system, effectively, de facto, not de jure, is that everybody can have the standard of living that they have in California. Well, you can't. And be sustainable. Therefore, the incumbent argument surely must be that we, those of us who do have that standard of living, have to cut our standards of living, and others have to have their standard of living raised. That is, it seems to me, not an argument that any specific classical realists made per se, but it's certainly one in keeping with their sense of limits, their sense of the way in which political thought and practice might move. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with seeing that as a liberal politics. It's just that it's not the liberal politics that we currently have, because the liberal politics that we currently have is predicated on a model of liberalism that is antithetical.
Couldn't put it better. Seriously, I mean, it's what, in a different context, Richard Flaxman once called another liberalism.
Yep.
Right? And the problem is that in much of political theory, arguably that form of liberalism is maybe a source of increasing interest. In international relations, it is not only not of interest, it is completely invisible. It is completely invisible. And that means that liberalism, which is, one might argue, emerging as the dominant way of thinking about international relations in the United States, certainly coming out of Princeton and places like that, which is a very interesting, you can do a wonderful realist analysis of the new liberalism, right? And people like John Ankenberg and Anne-Marie Slaughter. This is geostrategic liberalism in a way that the old liberalism never was. But the problem with international relations is that there is no category for this other understanding of liberalism, right? And that is a really, but one of the difficulties of that, to be quite honest with you, is even amongst people who are really quite sophisticated and familiar with a lot of these ideas, to try to make the argument that realism is liberalism, or was liberalism, is so counterintuitive as to be almost incomprehensible. And that's a real challenge.
There's a Hochhoff says about rationalism, as I said, rationalism politics. The problem with the rationalists is first they turn off the light, and then they complain they can't see. And I think that's part of the problem here, too.
Maybe not on the undergrad level, but maybe on the postgrad level, to try to teach it like more in this direction, to actually get into people's minds that realism is a way of trying to save liberal modernity on its own necessity.
And to come back to Andrew's point, the liberalism angle, I think, also works. that if you put those two angles together, then I think you really get something that functions.
That, just to build off of that, that's actually the famous course that was part of this, and he teaches liberalism as realism. He doesn't consider them to be different things. He says, and I mean, actually, I think it's not his joke, but it kind of encapsulates what he's saying, is that John Locke is just Thomas Hobbes who had a nice station on his sweater. It's sort of the way that he approaches it. That's not his joke, but that's kind of the way that's what he's saying, is that they're basically, you know, those are the same ideas, but we've taken different things from them and say that they're totally different concepts. He says Hobbes is the original liberal.
Yeah. But you do have to start actually in first year. Because once they've learned it in first year, then unlearning it is very, very difficult. It's like unlearning a bad habit.
Well, that's true, because the reaction to that lecture was he doesn't stop.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And also there's the other danger, which is, you know, they go to his stuff. The bright people will write to what Dane said, and then when they leave the course, they'll revert back. I mean, there is a kind of corrupting the youth thing here. It's a sort of a Socrates thing he's put on trial for. You know, there is a catching it in first year. Yeah, it is, exactly. We're meant to corrupt the youth, exactly. But I said, you know, I know what you're recording today. That's true.
In the Socratic.
In the Socratic sense, absolutely. Which of course brings us back to textbooks and why they all should be burned. Don't burn books. Oh, no.
Yes, I feel that what I wanted to say was not yet covered by Adam. But I was anxious to say something anyway. Again, the fact that this issue of strategy is very important, and I think there are trade-offs here, and I think this is what is implicit in what Nick is saying, that if you go for the disciplinary attention and you try to recruit people like sophisticated, rehabilitated figures like Waltz or I don't know, perhaps Stephen Walt, as you suggested, or John Mersheimer, in order to address the disciplinary audience, then you will make it too narrow, and it will only address perhaps narrow IR concerns. If you make it broader and you want to align it with the political theory, speak about the possibility of a realist political theory, then perhaps you might lose in coherence a bit in what we're doing now here as individuals and the possibility of bringing together a project, but you realign it to these important questions. This issue of what we're doing, why realism is important, because it poses the right questions about the nature of the political, about this tension between constraints and limits on the one side and the need for a political vision on the other. I think this is a more fruitful area, if you ask me. So we might have a little problem with coherence, perhaps, but or sort of appealing to a non-disciplinary audience, and that might be a problem. Not narrow disciplinary audience, that might be a problem. But I think you gain in addressing the sort of the real issues. Yes, I wanted to say something else. So, if you go for the first option, you might as well be aggressive, and instead of saying reorienting realism, you say reclaiming realism, because you want to reclaim them for new classical realist interpretations, neo-positivist interpretations. If you go for the latter sort of option, you might want to use another phrase. I don't know, reinvestigating or reorienting realism as you do. I think it fits with let's get to work. And just the final thing I want to say, is that I wonder whether there is an implicit tension or explicit tension between presenting realism as another form of liberalism within the American context, trying to see how it makes sense within the American context. And in many ways, this story makes sense. But one side is that, and the other, what Nick mentioned about the possibility of discussing realisms outside the North European and American context, in realist Indian international relations, political science or international relations, Chinese realist political theory and all that, and what sort of resonance Mike's story would have to what they want to say. So if we stick with that story as realism, realism as another way of a forgotten and neglected story about liberalism, which is in its own merit very important. Do we make any, do we have any relevance for, let's say the non-European, non-American audience?
Just one thought on that last point, which is that in the book that I mentioned, which is the collection of essays by Hans Tom, there's an interview with him, which is very interesting. In which what is astonishing is, first of all, he's a well-trained US political scientist, and that's clear. And he uses all of the standard categories of American IR theory, but then it's kind of mediated through both his own personal experiences. He was kicked out during the Cultural Revolution, and went to University of Edinburgh, and all this. A very strong nationalism, but which he does not believe is necessarily confrontational. Plus, this work that he's done on pre-Kim thought. And so, for example, one of the things he argues is that China has to take seriously the claim that the United States, after the Second World War, and still has a kind of moral authority that China cannot pretend to. And China has to develop that. And he uses pre-Kim thought to develop what he calls the notion of humane authority that the Chinese need to develop and are currently not developing. Indeed, they're going in the opposite direction. So this is a guy who's very influential in certain areas of the foreign policy, indeed, clearly, but he's by no stretch of the imagination simply towing the party line, whatever the party line might happen to be. And he is blending an American realist story, neo-realist, largely neo-realist story, with something else. The thing that seems to me to be interesting is that in itself is interesting. And if you're doing Mike's thing of narrating realism in the version of liberalism, what is that then saying about how other people, other cultures, other societies, other contexts are picking that up and translating it into their own idiom and developing it? And I think there might be some very interesting things to say about that. The other thing is just a sort of small caveat, which is to say, when one is thinking about people like Mearsheimer, I made the point myself, which is a very obvious point that Mearsheimer was making himself here. He's not a philosopher, he doesn't do philosophy, he doesn't do political theory. But we should be careful about imposing on others the disciplines that we ourselves are trying to outrun. And he's not a political theorist or a philosopher, but for example, the paper that I did for the Nobel, he asked to see a copy of it, and he sent me 3 pages of really interesting comments. The paper was on Strauss, and he's very interested in Strauss, and he shared it with Nathan Tarkov from Chicago, and I also got certain comments from Tarkov. So one should be careful about assuming that Mearsheimer is too narrow. I think he's open to wider things, and what he does, and we all know what he does, and he does it very well. And I don't think going to find a deep study of Leo Strauss emerging from Mearsheimer's pen in the near future. Nonetheless, he can be engaged. And on one strategy of what we might be doing here collectively, not all of us perhaps, but some of us, engaging somebody like Mearsheimer, even as an interlocutor, even a critical interlocutor, might not be a bad thing, because it gives you visibility in the cynical context. And the other thing, the final point I'll make is just, I don't know if any of you read, some of you certainly would have done, or heard perhaps, Mearsheimer's E.H. Carr lecture that he gave at Adelaide a couple of years back. But this is, which was called, I can't remember what the title was. The Battle Rages On, that's right, realism versus idealism, the battle rages on. And it elicited a series of responses from various prominent British IR scholars, of which my personal favourite was Chris Brown's, which was called No Jazz on the Radio. And basically, and it's like the response he gave to you, and said, not enough realism in your talk, meaning not enough realism of the sort that I do in your talk. And even engaging him by saying, well, actually, there's quite a lot of realism out there, and John Mearsheimer's version of realism 71. First of all, it's not a dialogue I think he would refuse, and secondly, it's something that would be quite fruitful, depending how you do it. So I just thought that's a small caveat. I mean, I think
in that sense, actually,
how do you
sorry. I mean, this comes back. This is why I kind of posed that question at the end, and I take Mike's point for sort of answering it very quickly in the affirmative, and I understand why. But there is this problem that these labels are very convenient cognitive shortcuts, and the point is that much in the same way as when you say appeasement, and immediately you don't have to say anything more. That said it all. We suffer from the same thing, and I mean it's a bit easier for me in some respects because if you're writing intellectual history, if you're writing disciplinary history or something like that, there's almost like the label's less important. I can get away with not doing it. I can write about Morgenthau as Morgenthau, or the many Morgenthau, and I never have to use the R word ever. But I do think it is a major problem, and yeah, I can remember as a worried supervisor talking to you about that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, talk about falling between two stools. As it turned out, I needn't worry, but.
I worked out reasonably okay.
Reasonably okay.
Sorry, if I could just jump in there. But I think it's precisely because of those shortcuts in the way that we're doing what we're doing.
Well, exactly.
That's how the discipline comes together. And I really want to stress again what Adam was saying in terms of the alliances, and also goes back to how can you, because I don't think the strategy, if there is such a thing, should be about trying to preach to all different disciplines, or rather try to engage with all of international law and all of moral philosophy and all of political theory. But there will be, in all of these places, and in other disciplines or fields, or whatever you want to call them, there will be people who will be amenable to these kinds of ideas that we're having. And it's that community that is spread out across all kinds of disciplines that one needs to congregate. And I think what Mike said earlier, there'll be a lot out there. And it's not just a couple here in the room, but you will find that there is a critical mass of sorts within all of these fields. And if you can engage those, yes, even by reiterating that there are these cognitive shortcuts, because that's we have to have an undergraduate textbook, right? Let's be honest, none of us could teach this stuff.
I don't use undergrad textbooks. No.
But Morgenthau hadn't had the problem that after Quincy Wright left Chicago, that there was no more international law in the kind of curriculum that he was supposed to teach, and suddenly his international law stuff fell off the table. Right? We wouldn't be having all of these re-emerging and reintegrating and rehabilitating Morgenthau. Right, so it's part and parcel of how all of this works. But I think it's these alliances.
There's just, absolutely right. I was having a conversation with Jeremy Waldron recently, and he says that he now teaches a course also on 20th century legal theory. They read 5 books. Hart, Kelson, Dworkin, Finnis, that's it. Nothing else. And you can, all, in a sense, all fields of inquiry, sadly, when it comes to constructing syllabi and constructing course lists, obviously have to be selected, they can't do everything. So there's a tendency that you get a version of that in every field. And IR has its own version, political theory has its version, political science, well, of course, they don't do much reading, has its list of equations. So this is a generic problem, it seems to me. So one response to you is to say exactly, to find that people are interested to talk to you and whom you are interested to talk in the various cognate fields. I think that we need to reach out beyond the traditional values and social sciences towards the humanities, including the bits of the humanities that acceptable opinions not accepted, which all theology. I have a paper coming out from the journal IR called on theology of international relations, world politics beyond the empty sky, which is arguing for not a reiteration of theology IR, but a conversation between theological concerns and international concerns. Because I think there's a lot of interesting work going on in philosophy of religion and theology that touches on some of the concerns activating the aspects of IR. I do not expect Bob Kirby to be an avid reader of that article. But there will be people in IR who will be, and hopefully there will be people in theology who will too. So those sorts of links, I think, absolutely one should draw. And ultimately, it does come down to, Sean mentioned the Deleuze and realism piece and talked about the discipline and how it would spread through the discipline. Well, the thing is that depends on what the discipline is. And the discipline, in my view, politics and IR as a discipline, if you want to call it that, is a discipline in the institutional sense. It's got chairs and departments and journals and conferences and all of that. In the traditional academic sense, it's not a discipline. It's an interdiscipline, a meeting point of discipline. So it depends what discipline you want to reach. If you want reach the meeting point of disciplines, then your point is absolutely spot on. We will find people, there will be people who will read your article on realism and realism in that sense of the field. But if you're expecting more permanent communities,
no, it's for people to get access to that very, very limited number of people who would actually organically read that kind of piece. I think that's the problem that everybody in this is going to have. We talk about this with Vasquez a lot. Vasquez's work is at the intersection of theology, politics, and international relations, and philosophy as well. Now, it's because of this almost nexus-like nature of our work that we find ourselves, if we send stuff, if we always get the feedback back, this isn't like that. Right? Or if we send it to the theatre, this isn't theatre. So this is the kind of obstacle we face in terms of getting out of our ghetto or trying to break down the ghetto. Is that because, let's face it, we're constitutionally drawn to the nexus. Right? So we are not narrowly approaching critical theory or international relations or whatever. We're trying to do that, but we come up against the disciplinary barrier that is not permeable. But we want a permanent.
Well, Richard said, let's start the journal.
Well, how do you do that? And who would do it? And how do you get it across? That's part of the bigger.
But this is where one has to think seriously through the structure of science and the structure of social science, right? I mean, to reflect again back on my own experience in security studies. You know, to the best of my knowledge, certainly in IR, the most successful subgenre ever created out of Europe is the Copenhagen School of Securitization Theory, right? The bloody thing is everywhere. It's rampant. And that, it's a very smart thing, and it's very fertile, and all the rest of that. But it's not just that, right? It's a thing. This comes back to the pluralization. If you want to create a school in the intellectual context, it cannot be a school of plurality. There is a core, right, to a school. A school demands adherence to certain sets of tenets and people who see themselves engaged in a common project. And without that, you can forget ever being a school. You might be able to be something else, tendency of movement, whatever, right? But you're never going to be a school. Anyone has to just take that seriously. And I think all the empirical evidence in what we do demonstrates that that's the case. And I think the counter case of emancipation in the Aberystwyth school demonstrates that perfectly, right? Let's debate what emancipation is. It still goes on, but it never takes on.
So you find sympathetic journals, sympathetic editors, and so on. And of course, in most mainstream journals, that will change every 4 or 5 years because the editors change. And so, the review is fine now on Kim. In 5 years' time, it might not be so sympathetic. So that's just, again, part of the sociology of any academic field. That's just what we do. But then again, there are ways, I think, that even if you don't want to become a school in the sense of Copenhagen School, you can create a momentum behind a set of ideas. And I think to some extent, the very fact that this conference is happening, and the people who are coming here who want to do it, want to take part in it, is indicative that that's happening. It's happening around the work that people have done in this field before, Sean's work, Mike's work, Hartmut's work. In other words, there's stuff going on already that we can build on, and that we can, as it were, act as force multipliers for the kinds of things we're trying to do. So, there's no point in wanting, suddenly as an international organisation to publish realism today, going to happen. But that doesn't mean to say that similar things won't get out of a good place and make a splash in the field. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. It can be partly contingent. But we can certainly do things to make it less contingent.